Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate everyone that's been able to join us for our next in our series of LinkedIn Lives. I'm Mike Sullivan. I'm one of the managing directors and the on location market leader here at Embark, coming live to you from the nice, chilly confines of Dallas, Texas this afternoon. Gotta love Dallas in the summer. It's always nice and cool. We have a great group today. I'm going to let them introduce themselves here momentarily. But before we get started, again, our topic today is budget planning tips for better data, efficient processes, and forecast accuracy. We're looking forward to a question and answer session after we finish up today. So if you have any Q&A, please hold on to it until we finish the initial presentation portion of the presentation, and we'll get to it towards the end. We look forward to answering some of your questions, and that's what makes these fun and informative, is having a little bit of back and forth with the audience. So uh, looking forward to some participation this afternoon. With that, we've got a couple of learning objectives. We're going to talk about identifying common problems. We're going to talk about how to improve and the benefits of improvement. We're going to go through two use cases. And then we're going to wrap up with some of the best practices that we found in our budgeting processes that we've worked with clients. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my fellow co-hosts here. First, starting with the ladies as always, with Stacy, and then with Nick. So Stacy, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. I'm Stacey Galligan, Managing Director. I'm based in Denver, Colorado, and I work in our financial advisory service line practice. I've been at Embark for about 3 years, and prior to Embark, I was in industry, the last portion, working as a CFO for several PE-backed companies.
All
Right
right,
on.
thanks, Stacy. And Nick Bermuda's here, EPM service line leader here at Embark. I'm based out of Phoenix, so we are getting some lovely weather here. It's currently 110 this week, but hoping to see a dip in the coming weeks. I've been at Embark for roughly a year and a half now. Prior to joining Embark, I was implementing ERP solutions at Anaplan and Deloitte. And prior to that, I was implementing SAP ERP implementations. So I've been chasing go lives in all systems or various systems for a while now.
Right on. Well, Stacy and Nick, delight to have you both with me today. And with that, let's get right into it. So we'll start off today with talking about some common budgeting problems. Is We all get ready for a new budget season, which is very shortly going to be upon us. And, one of the things that we always talk about with our clients, because usually it's where the first phone call starts, is a client will ring us and say, "Hey, Mike, hey, Stacy, hey, Nick, our budgeting process just isn't that great. It works, but it doesn't work super well. It's inefficient, and we're a little frustrated by it." And a lot of clients, it's sort of funny because there's a little bit of a shame with it. Like, everybody thinks that their budgeting process should be perfect, and it's an iterative process. It's never going to be perfect. It's more along the lines of, every year you want to get a little better. You want to find those ways to streamline it, clean it up, take out manual processes, much of like what we do with other projects, but budgeting is no different. And sort of, I don't want to say admitting you have a problem first is the good step, but it is like seeing where your holes are and where your issues lie before you get into it is a great way to sort of start. Um, so, I know that the process itself has holes, but oftentimes we'll look at the process and the next thing we notice is data. So, Nick, I think you were mentioning to me earlier about some of the data challenges you faced.
Yeah, a lot of times what I see, especially kind of when we integrate with systems, right? Or before we get into the integration part of systems, a lot of companies are just spending so much time trying to get historical data to a clean point where they can actually start to leverage this for forecasting processes, right? Like before you can even go and start doing your budgeting, you have to have a clear picture of what's actually happened in your organization. And if you're spending hours or just doing a lot of manual activity trying to get your data clean to a point where you can actually start to understand and dissect it, it's something that just makes the entire budgeting process even more tiring. So, I think that's probably the first step in problems I see when we go through a lot of projects is just making sure that we have good, clean historical data that's ready to be used for the kickstart of budgeting. Um, to avoid a lot of the manual aspects of it, I think there are systems and different automations that could be set up to help you streamline some of that data collection of actuals and try to get it to a view that's apples to apples. Um, business changes over time, and so a lot of the times what we're seeing is a company will either go through acquisition or some change in the business that's causing things to maybe not be an apples to apples view in their historical data. And so getting things to a point where it's easy to understand and digest, I think, is an important part before you even kickstart any budgeting cycle.
So true. Gathering the data and being able to rely on it is absolutely important. So we've touched on the process and we've touched on the technology, but the first thing is always the people. And Stacy, I think you've had plenty of experience with the people portion of it.
Oh, for sure. I think one of the things that I commonly see at companies is either, just bandwidth resource issues of, one person having 5 million jobs. And then all of a sudden now we're throwing budgeting in that isn't necessarily something that they always do from a monthly state. And then they're trying to get something in and done, which can make it hard. And along with that, maybe somebody who doesn't really have the expertise to understand how to build out a budget process and a model that really gets it fully integrated, to be able to understand what's going on in the business and include drivers. One of the things along with that is in correlated is the incomplete budget models that you create, right? So you're missing key drivers within the business, including, as we've all seen lately in the last several years, significant price changes, pricing that you may need to go, do for your own to cover some of the inflationary costs that you've incurred, poor revenue projections, excluding capital expenditures, right? So you could have these models that just aren't even built properly to put all the drivers in, which sometimes is correlation of just not having that skill set in-house to be able to create those things.
Yeah, and that so perfectly leads us into the next section, which is talking about, just a good process, the benefits that come out of it. And I think that's number one is, being able to have confidence in your budget. When the people are rushed, when the data is questionable, and when the overall process isn't incredibly well defined, it's very difficult to have confidence in your budget. And you'll go into it saying, well, we think this works, but we're not 100% sure if it does. And that's never a place you want to be. You really want to do have, confidence in your budget. So, having confidence is number one. And then number two is just being able to do it in a timely and efficient manner. And yeah, Stacey, I think you were talking about that too, that you don't want to spend all day because people have other jobs as well.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this a lot and Nick, I think you can add on a little bit later too of how can you make it more efficient and utilize tools besides just people. But I think one of the big things is if you can build a process and have your data clean, then you can spend less time on it. And when you're spending less time, that doesn't always correlate to meaning like you need less people in your organization. It means those people can go and focus on things that you really are going to be able to drive a change within your business. So instead of manually adjusting things or putting things into a system, they can spend time analyzing it, and you can get to the why faster and sooner to be able to then drive pieces. And I think the other big thing that I always tend to also say is, when you can make something work better and efficiently, a lot of times your people are happier. And when your people are happier and they're getting more joy and fulfillment out of their jobs because they're not maybe doing some of those manual tasks, the morale of your team and where you can drive as a business can really be impacted. So although it seems very odd that happy morale building could be part of your budgeting process, I do think there's a little bit of it where it helps not only drive financial results, but can also help drive some of the culture things that people need to work on, because there gets a little bit more visibility in where you spend your time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think to add to that, right? I think a lot of the implementations that I've been on, it's really just to free people up to start analyzing data rather than spending all this time trying to complete these budget templates and collect them all and let's go through another iteration and sort of repeat the process and go through that same time consuming activity. So to your point, right, having a process that's clearly defined and efficient and able to move through things cleanly, and still allows you to kind of have some of the levers to pull to get to the outcomes and be able to really get to the analyzing versus the prepping, I think is a huge benefit that any organization can have.
Yeah, no, no, absolutely. So, and Stacy, would you even go so far to say, as you know, if the team is happy that your performance across the organization is better, that those teams feel empowered and they feel a sense of ownership?
For sure. I mean, I think not only, and I think one of the things that I think is really important in the budget process is not having a siloed budget within just the accounting and finance organization, but the whole entire organization. And so if you're including all of your departments, your operations, your sales, your marketing, your HR, all the different team members that have ownership of the business, when they are empowered and included in the budget process and understand how the goals of the company, as well as what are the drivers, what's really driving maybe a change in revenue this year or the change in costs, it empowers them to be able to actually go and execute upon that because they understand what their guardrails are and they understand the goals that you're trying to achieve. And I think when people are empowered, they understand the path that you're going on, you get a lot more enjoyment out of your job. And when you get more enjoyment out of your job, it's just like anything, right? If you enjoy running, you're going to do it more and you're going to go and be better at it. If you hate running, it's like a chore and you don't want to go do it, and you'll find all sorts of different excuses to not go running, right? And it's very similar with jobs.
Yeah, I don't want to get up and budget today. I know. I don't think we've ever said that, but we certainly feel it.
No.
It's so true. So,
So
well, so
that's
then
silent
let's,
thing inside of you.
of course. Well, so then let's hop into some use cases that we've actually seen with our clients, and give you a little taste and a preview of what's to come in terms of best practices and things that we've seen. But like I said, let's dive into two actual scenarios that we've experienced. So I think the first one, Stacy, is yours. Mid-sized org, approximately 100 million in revenues. Real straightforward process, but incredibly manual. So why don't we talk about that for a hot minute?
Sure. So, example is kind of a multi-location backed company organization, pretty basic revenue stream as well, not very complex. Not There are no international locations, so you're not working with foreign currency or anything like that as well. But still, small organization, not putting a lot of resources towards any kind of automation or systems, which we see a lot of. And that's okay. A lot of companies, that's, sometimes you want to focus those resources on the operations or systems that are going to help the sales team, and very appropriate, right? And so having issues of building that model, because maybe some basic assumptions, even though the business overall may be simple, you have, multi locations, you have different products, things like that came into play, but all done in Excel.
Mm, yep. It seems sort of amazing that here we are. I think we're probably 35 years into Excel being the most common tool used in a lot of FP&A forecasts, and there's a lot of other options out there, and yet, wouldn't you say, Stacy, it's still the most common tool that we see clients use.
I will have to say, I have never used anything but Excel. Just mainly from my background, as even in industry when I was working, or most of my clients here are, that middle market type based company, and just haven't yet invested or had the resources to implement any kind of system. It's always like the last thing. And it's okay, depending on the company and the organization, but there is a point in time, just like, living in QuickBooks and your accounting, a point where you need a new ERP. There is a point in time where there is some benefits, and it's either in the data side sometimes of how can you get the data into Excel and then build it out, which can be really helpful, and or even putting the models you've created in Excel into some type of tool. So there is a point where it does make sense, but unfortunately for me, most of my clients and most of my experiences is Excel budgets.
You're
Sure.
missing out.
Yeah.
I know. So I'm here. I'm going to learn from you, Nick.
So, Nick, I think you're going to talk next about a little more complex organization.
Yeah. So the one example that we have later on, it's a company, 250 million in revenue, and just a really more complex, sophisticated budgeting cycle. Several locations, international, so there's multi-currency kind of to factor in here, and just really a complex model. And as they've gone through growth, it's really just transpired from having one individual spreadsheet to having several different, templates where they have to go and share these out and collect input from everyone, try to consolidate, all of these inputs into a common file to really get the insights that they're trying to get from each location. And so it's become just an unmanageable process really, and more of a burden. And so the example we'll talk about later, it's really trying to find the efficiencies of getting away from that and trying to get to a tool that really helps you aggregate and collect all this data. So you're not really spending time going through the song and dance of having to get all this information together and start to understand it.
Yeah, and that's honestly yet another perfect segue into our next portion, which is sort of the best practices and tactics. And the first one I wanted to talk about today is the holistic planning process. Before you start, you have to understand where you're at and where you've been, and that starts with the look back. Looking at the actuals from last year, doing sort of a final check to make sure they're accurate. Any final adjustments or allocations is so essential because it's difficult to start and forecast properly. Like you said, Nick, you got to trust the data, and the data has to be accurate. So doing that look back initially is just so critical and so important. And it's not just looking at the financial statement; it's looking at other key KPIs in making sure that those KPIs, if there was a transaction that occurred, whether it be a purchase, a divestiture, that those are properly allocated, that those were properly accounted for, and there aren't any hidden costs, revenues, or other factors that might throw the budget off. A great example that we ran into about 2 years ago with a client was they were a software company, and they vastly outperformed their budget for the year, and they thought everything was good, but they weren't really paying attention to the fact that part of the reason why they really outperformed their budget was because of a foreign currency movement that was really unexpected. When they took the foreign currency movement out, they realized that not only did they not beat budget, they actually came in slightly behind plan. And that was a great example of not properly monitoring throughout the year got them to where they started to plan going forward and realized that they were standing on quicksand when it came to where they needed to be for the next year. So it really is a holistic approach that needs to happen in terms of looking at your data, looking at more than a financial statement, making sure you really understand what your KPIs are. So with that, you want to set out some big vision, some key goals and such. And Nick, I think you'll talk about that.
I'm going to
Yeah.
take this one.
You're going to take this one? Okay.
I'm taking this one because I have
okay.
this
All
one.
right.
We're switching
You
up.
take it then, Stacey. Go for it.
That's fine. Sorry. So some of the key goals, and I think one of the big things when you start out is really aligning that from the top down, right? So an example I have is one of my clients, going through what they said or thought was a budgetary process with the existing CFO of a highly acquisitive, PE-backed home healthcare business, about 150 to 200 million in revenue after some of the first, 3 initial acquisitions that were done. And there was no alignment at the executive level or any communication down to the organizations below. Mm-hmm. And because of that, when you go in, and what we discovered is that budgets were done at all the different acquisitions in different manners, in different ways, looking at revenues in an inconsistent manner to how they really wanted to manage the business, as well as achieving the growth that they were expecting or wanting to build into that budget. So really from the stakeholder level, we came in January, so very late to the game, to try to get a budget done for a board meeting in February. So it was, very much late nights, all hands on deck that tend to happen at times. But the very first thing we did was, okay, let's see what we have, obviously. So seeing what data we have. And then from there was, what is actually the goals? What are we wanting to achieve? And then making sure all of the departments understood that. Because if I, let's say in our operations team or our sales team, and I have separate goals that either need resources from IT or more people or more bodies, but that's inconsistent with the end of the goals, or we're trying to each do different strategic initiatives that aren't integrated and no one knows about them, you're going to create budgets that don't get you to the consolidated end goals, right? So aligning that and spending time on as in a team, as a leadership team, of really saying, okay, these are our 5 things we're going after this year. Everyone's aligned. This is where we're going to put the resources toward those things. So when you go back to start building your budget, you know that, and you don't put in things that you want, right? Like there's always those wish list things that we see groups put in. But sometimes just taking that a little bit of time can really make for a more efficient process. So we were actually able to like realign, get everyone on the same boat, and get some budgets pulled out, which still were not ideal by any means, but at least the much better guide rails for everybody as we moved into the next year, of where we needed to go and what do we need to do to achieve those goals, happened. So
Yeah, and those, and it seems so simple, but yet so many companies don't take the very, I would say, quick task of just getting everyone aligned.
yeah.
And with that, Nick, now I'll let you talk about initial budget.
Yeah.
Yeah. So going in and creating the initial budget, I guess what I typically see in a lot of my implementations is teams are trying to get away. Obviously, everybody wants to go in and have the detail in creating this bottoms up forecast, right? And being able to go in and manually do all these activities to get to the numbers that they need. Um, what I've seen a lot of organizations start trying to do is have driver based forecasting approaches to at least get a starting point in there. And so when you're going and logging into a system, typically is what I see, you're able to have something to review right off the bat instead of having to go and collect all of this information from all of these different regions or locations to go and generate a forecast, but having some type of driver based approach, whether it's looking at actuals and trying to project a trend, or whatever the methodology is, right? But I think having a starting point allows you to get into this iterative, sort of forecasting process quicker than it would be if you're having to wait for everybody to go and enter this information. Doesn't mean you have to stick to the number that the system spits out, but it at least is a starting point to give you a head start on this is the direction actuals are telling you to go. Go in and massage this as you feel is needed to get to the numbers that you're trying to forecast to. But as a starter, this should be a pretty good head start. And so having something in place, I think, to get you moving is really key, because it's such a big just undertaking to go in and have to enter in a bunch of lines in a spreadsheet every budgeting cycle, and really have to just try to get it done in the timelines that are set. And if you have an example like Stacy just mentioned, where you're in there in January trying to present to a board in February, it's a tall task. So
Yeah, no, without a doubt. And so that sort of takes us to the next step, which is doing your revisions. And of course, you want to incorporate feedback. And going back to what you both said, when you have the alignment, it's easier to incorporate feedback. There's a lot fewer revision cycles, and it's usually a one shot, maybe two shot revision, as opposed to, well, we're waiting on ops, we're waiting on manufacturing, we're waiting on purchasing for numbers that then skew and cause a recalc and a reforecast multiple times over. So you want to incorporate feedback, but you also don't want to revision yourself to death. The perfect is the enemy of the really, really good. You want to trust your budget. So when I say don't revision yourself to death, you also have to remember too that sometimes there's just factors that are playing out of your control. That if you see something clouds forming on the horizon in terms of potential interest rate increases or inflation, you need to build that in, but you also have to realize that sometimes those are just out of your control. Years back when I worked at one of the big four, I was privy to a budgeting process with a customer that was able to push through, it seemed like, monthly price increases. They were a large manufacturer of semi-finished goods, and every month they were just pushing through another price increase. And they were like, well, what do we do? Do we plan for 10%? Do we plan for 20%? Do we plan for 30%? And they spent a lot of time, and 6 months later they found out that those price increases were highly transitory, and the price crashed, and the whole budget went to pieces. So you have to use the data, and you have to use the information you have at the time. Go with those one or two good clean revisions, and move on it. And with that, Nick, you can talk a little bit about the final sign off and the go forward plan.
yeah, I mean, I think just bringing everybody together to review this, right, and everybody having buy-in and just confidence in those numbers. I think a lot of times we see clients who spend so much time in trying to get to the perfect number, and at the end of the day, as soon as you submit a budget or forecast, right, the next month it's inherently wrong, right? It changes. And so really, like, spending too much time is not necessarily the best thing to do. You want to have confidence and everybody have buy-in in those numbers, but you really don't need to spend too much time after that. Once everything's been submitted and all the drivers have been checked and everybody has a good sense of this is a realistic plan for us, I think it's just going with that and then reacting sort of as you move throughout the year. I don't know,
Yeah.
Stacy, if you have anything to add to that, but
Well, one thing I was thinking through as we were just kind of talking about this too is part of the revisions or finalizing budgets is having some different scenarios, right? So being able to see it within your budget to easily build it in a way where if the pricing, to Mike's example, goes one way, what does that mean, right? So
yeah.
you have those abilities to say, okay, here's this, a lot of times you hear best case scenario, here's the middle of the budget, here's like worst case scenario, and you land somewhere in there, right? But having some of that ability to be agile, which seems odd in a budget process, but it is. It's really important, right? Like if you're about to finalize, I don't know how many times I've been in meetings with my CEOs and COOs, and they're like, "Well, what if we do this?" And then you're like, "Okay," and you can't tell them, yeah, give me 3 days and I'll be back to tell
Right.
you what that is, right? Like you want to be able to adjust it pretty quickly, if not live, to show what that impact is on your balance sheet, your cash flows, your EBITDA, whatever it is that you're attacking and trying. So I think to Mike's point, not creating revisions, but having something where you can show some different scenarios quickly also helps prevent having to revise so much, right? Because you can say, like, we're going to go with this because we know if this happens, we're going to be somewhere over here. And if we do this, we're going to be somewhere over here. We can kind of have a good visualization of that. So you don't have to keep refining it because, yeah, I mean, you finish the budget, you present it to the board, but between the finishing of the budget and your board, meeting to approve the budget, it's already wrong. And then it's the next year starts and it's definitely wrong. So just having more of a 80-20 rule, 90-10, whatever it is really important because it needs to have agile and ability to adjust as new information comes in the future year.
And just for the record, we're not saying very wrong. We're saying a little bit wrong. We're
Oh
saying
yeah,
it's not
we're not yet.
perfect. It went from 100 to 98%. So okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're
Yeah,
talking.
of
You
course.
want to have a good, you don't want to have a covenant bust because your budget's bad, and then you plan accordingly, and you've incurred a bunch of costs that are going to cause problems, right? You don't want to
Hmm.
have a bad budget that causes cash flow issues because you expected, 25% growth and you only achieved 3, right?
Hmm.
So you need to have definitely some accuracy, which is important, right? That's for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So let's touch on sort of how technology and data play together here real quick. So maybe just for a minute or two, the pros and cons of using Excel versus an EPM tool. Nick, I'll let you go first if you want to talk about what you've seen, pros and cons and use cases.
Yeah, use case wise, I mean, just looking at the budgeting process in general, right? A lot of the organizations that we go into, it's just Excel is now unmanageable. We've outgrown it. It was great for us as we were kind of getting started and kicking things off, and now we've either gone through acquisition or we've expanded to different territories and things like that. And it's really just too much for my team to really manage on a month to month and year over year basis. And so what you're really getting from moving away from Excel and onto a sophisticated tool is just the time savings and the flexibility and agility, I think, that we talked about earlier, and having one, just all of your data sort of automated and integrated into these systems. So you're eliminating the process of having to go back and understand sort of what the data needs to look like in order to get into a digestible view. But you're also getting the automation and roll-ups of like all of these different locations and templates to a clear and concise, like, financial statement view right at the top of the company. You're not having to go and collect and try to make sure there's a clear and concise view, as a CFO to really understand. So it's the combination of all these. You go to understanding what my business is doing a lot quicker, than you would if you're having to go through a lot of the manual processes that you're having to in Excel. A lot of the tools out there now also facilitate, like, just the workflow of the budgeting cycle. So, hey, we're kicking things off. I'm going to get an email notification as a planner, revenue planner, that I have to go in and start things. I'm going to go enter my task. Once I'm complete, I'm going to mark it as complete. And the next person in line is going to get a notification that I have to go and now take action on my part of the budgeting process. So it's these workflows, it's the automations, it's the aggregations, right? It's all of these efficiencies, I think, that you're getting from moving to a tool that just is a lot more cumbersome in tools like Excel. But depending on where you're at as an organization, right, there's going to be some benefits to moving on to one, and maybe just Excel, the simplicity of it is probably the right choice because you're not that complex yet. But Stacy, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
No, I
Absolutely.
agree. I mean, I think it's a resource allocation, especially for those small to mid-sized companies. You have limited resources, right? Versus some of the larger firms or companies that we work with. So helping them prioritize where they're going to put those resources, either people, time, or funds, right? And so I see that a lot. I think the other con I hear a lot about is I may be a mid-market size company, a couple million, maybe less than a million, but my revenue is very complex and my business is very, very complex. And these tools can't be developed to match my business, right? It's not agile enough. And so I do see that because when you're in those small to mid markets, maybe some of the tools to help you in a budgeting process don't match your business and how they operate. And so then it actually causes more issues. I think the other thing that I see, which isn't necessarily a pro to con to both, but kind of back to not having a model built out well or having an actual personnel from like that, we always talk about in this firm, people, process, technology, right? You go to implement a technology to solve a people or process issue, and that system's not going to solve it. So if you don't have an idea of how you want your model to be built, you can't take a bad model and then try to put it into a system and have the system fix your model issues. It's going to still be bad, right?
Right.
So I think that's the other big thing where I have seen companies, I have had a couple clients where they're trying to implement a budgeting tool and it keeps going sideways. And the end of it is that either they don't have people who understand the business well enough. What are those drivers, to Mike's point earlier, defining your historical KPIs, understanding truly the business. Is it are you a volume price? What is the key points that are going to drive any growth in your business from a revenue? How do you cost reduction, cost stabilization, anything like that? If you don't have that understanding of the underlying drivers in your model, no system's going to fix that, right? So I think that's the other piece
Very
that
true.
I see a lot, and why companies don't end up going with a system is that they feel like they have a little bit more control to be unique in Excel, but they still have problems, and then expect the system to fix it. So
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, you're so right. All a system's going to do is exactly what, as an implementer, we tell it to do, right? And so if the process is bad going into an implementation, obviously through any implementation, we try to do some, business process reengineering, or just think through, hey, is there a better way to go about this than what you guys are currently doing? But yeah, if it's a bad model to begin with, right, it's going to yield bad results. There's bad data going into the model, right, it's going to yield bad
yeah,
results. So those two things in parallel, I think, are uh, essential to any implementation.
yeah. I mean, I think you
Yeah.
have to treat it like a system implementation, any kind of doing that first phase of discovery
Right.
and all of that, of really building that fit first and fixing it, and then doing the implementation. And then you can really see, I think, a ton of benefits, especially from like the data collection, reporting, ease type situation.
And I
Right.
think that's a great way to put it, both Nick and Stacy. A budget is in many ways a system. It's a system in and of itself of tracking performance. So whether it's a manual system or an automated system, it is a system. So it does follow very much an implementation life cycle. So great point. Um, that leads me to sort of the last topic in this area, which is reporting. As you're finishing up the budget and putting it together, one of the things that's fairly common, and we see this a lot with companies that have gone through transactions, is they put a budget together and it's a great budget and it had a lot of thought put to it, but then they realize almost immediately that to track to the budget, they're going to have to do some sophisticated reporting and they can't do it. Like they literally can't go in and pull the data that they need to to track budget to actuals. And then they'll call us up afterwards and be like, well, we have this great budget, but we don't know where to get the data. So can you please come like really, really soon and start digging through our database? Because we don't know where to find these numbers. And it's a surprise. It's sort of a crazy surprise, but it's a surprise that happens more often than not. So when you do put your budget together, think about, hey, how are we going to report out to this? Where are we going to pull our data from? And again, do we trust it from this system or that system? And if we don't, do we need to verify before we run reports and see that we can pull reporting that's straightforward, that feeds properly, and doesn't require an enormous amount of manual intervention to get it to where we need it to be.
Yeah. And Mike, I know your background leans to this, so I'm going to kind of be devil's advocate because I know you know the answer, but you're not just talking financial information in the budget. It's
Correct.
the other piece, right? It's the operational behind
Absolutely.
it, right? So it's not
Yeah.
just the financial numbers that you can't report on, it's those operational pieces, right? And maybe, do you have any examples of that, of, companies where the drivers or those KPIs aren't in the budget or easy to pull out, or you can't get them from an actual standpoint?
Oh yeah. For example, in manufacturing, especially we see this up in the Northeast with a lot of companies nowadays, that are in businesses that require large amounts of natural gas for heating or drying or things like that. That they don't have an easy way to pull what their daily or weekly. Assuming that they're not on a contract, which some are and some aren't. But if you're not on a contract, what your gas prices are, something like that, you can say, okay, our unit costs on a particular widget were fairly straightforward. The raw materials fell exactly in line, but yet our overhead went up. Well, why did that? Well, you could spend time digging through all that, or you could know that, hey, you know what, we need an easy way to report on, for example, the cost of natural gas being an input into our production process to be able to figure out how we're tracking budget. So hopefully that was what you're thinking of, Stacy.
Exactly what I was trying to think. So yes.
Perfect. There you go. Love it. Love it. So, so then, as the year goes on, talking about sort of, the intermediate checkpoints and then just how you're monitoring and optimizing your budget. Um, it's also interesting too. We have a current client, and they're a great client. We like working with them a lot. But they have decided that they want to do an incredibly aggressive forecast, and they want to do a very, very aggressive look back. So instead of doing the traditional X plus Y, so a two plus 10 or a 3 plus 9 or a 6 plus 6, they want to do weeklies. So they're expending enormous amounts of resources, both internally and with us, to be able to report off of those numbers. And it's driving change in the organization, and it's holding everyone very accountable. But it comes at an incredibly high cost in the organization. Like I said, both from external resources and their team working 60 and 70-hour weeks every single week to be able to do that sort of reporting. So set the expectation up front. Is there a reason that we need to do weekly reporting? Can we do monthly reporting? Or, do we have a business cycle that lends itself to quarterly reporting? We actually have clients that are very successful that do quarterly reporting, and they know when they're doing their quarterly reports. It would seem a bit wild to have that big of a gap and a look back. But for certain clients, it actually does work well. So think about how you want to set your checkpoints in the correct cadence. Are we doing monthly board reviews, quarterly board reviews? What are we doing in terms of management reviews? All good things to think about as you're progressing through the year. And there's no shame in changing too. If you get a month into it and realize that, we're doing these biweekly reports and we're not seeing a whole lot of added value by compiling all this information so aggressively, there's no shame in saying, let's take it back to a monthly report, and let's spend more time analyzing and figuring out how we can improve as opposed to just assembling this data. So I think that's a good takeaway as well. So with that, that's the sort of planned out portion of the LinkedIn Live that we have today. We've got a couple of questions coming through, but some initial thoughts and questions for the audience that we have. You know, building on that last item that I just said, how many of you reforecast and what is your cadence? We'd love to hear. If you reforecast, why or why not? And have you chosen a new cadence recently? Has it been a historical? We'd love some feedback on that because that helps us initiate conversations and give our clients, who you may be one of, data points from around the business universe. Um, with that, like I said, we'll open it up if there's any comments or questions. We'd love to answer them. And as we wait for those to happen, Nick or Stacy, any wrap up items?
Nothing too big on my end. I think the one closing sort of thought that I just had as you were speaking through just the changing in just your overall process. I can't tell you how many times I've gone into an implementation and things have changed mid-flight, right?
Mm,
During the implementation, and it's just, hey, we've realized we're able to get different insights than we were, right, in our old way of doing things. Can we do this forecasting process, whatever it is, a component of your budget, right? Can we do this differently? And so I think to iterate that point, like in a budgeting or forecast cycle, things change all the time, right? There is no like, once we set this up, this is the way it needs to be done all the time. Even in a system, right? There are constant
mhm.
changes I think that take place, um,
The
and
only
it's
constant
just
is change, right?
right, exactly. There's always something to improve upon, I think, in these processes.
For sure. That's actually where I was going to say go is just because you have a budget process, especially if you have like Excel, right? Like I don't know how many times you roll forward your budget templates from last year, right? Is taking some time at the beginning to think through what changes have come in the business, what changes are you wanting to drive for too, and how to make sure you build that into your process, into your templates and that sort of thing. Because, you know,
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, Well, with that, no additional questions. We'll wrap up for the day. Stacy, Nick, thank you so much for joining us, and especially to the audience and everyone that's out there. Thank you for listening in on our LinkedIn Live today. We're always looking forward to connecting with you, our audience, and our clients. Feel free to reach out to us via LinkedIn, via email. If you prefer, we're always happy to set up a call. Sometimes it's just a question, and we're always happy to answer it. We'll have some more of our LinkedIn Live series coming up here in the next week, so keep your eyes peeled. Our team is working hard on putting those together, and we look forward to having you join us for another session very soon. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us.